Other rock and roll stories, Merrill Osmond. Merrill Osmond, one of the famous Osmond brothers. How did I meet Merrill Osmond? I'll be very brief. Basically, managing a media centre at the Rothes Halls. For those of you who don't know the Rothes Halls, they're kind of mini SECC, lots of bands play there. One evening we were working late, suddenly the door opened and this kind of psychedelic Elvis walks in. Head to toe, white jumpsuit, flares, wings, the lot. Looked like Santa Claus, big white beard, white hair out to here. Merrill Osmond. And he stopped. He looked at it, he looked a bit dazed, and he said, is this the way to the stage? Terrible accent, my apologies. He said, is this the way to the stage? And we said, no, you've come into the media centre, you need to go back out and take the second row on the left. And he said, oh, thanks guys, sorry about that, sorry to interrupt you and all that kind of stuff. And then off he went and did his show. So, tenuous, but I was technically in the same space as Merrill Osmond for perhaps about 3 minutes. So, TV world. Well, I suppose the celeb I've known the best was probably the late Gareth Thomas. Now, Gareth Thomas was RADA trained. He was at RADA with John Hurt and Patrick Stewart. He came to prominence on the BBC in the 70s in a show called, I think, Sutherland's Law, which was about some lawyers in the Highlands. And he'd also been in a number of films. In fact, I recently saw him in Juggernaut, which is a Richard Harris film. But Gareth's claim to fame is that in the 70s, the BBC put a second science fiction show into production called Blake 7. Now, Blake 7 was a lot darker than Doctor Who. It's basically about a group of renegades who are fighting a kind of tyrannical power called the Federation. They're almost like kind of resistance fighters in space. Now, in its day, this show was massive, and if it had been produced by the Americans rather than by the BBC, perhaps it could have gone on to become a Star Trek. But anyway, it was a massive show, and I was certainly a big fan of it when I was at school. But never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I would actually get to meet and befriend Gareth Thomas. So how did this curious tale occur? Well, some of you may know that I worked as a college lecturer. Started off at Motherwell, and then in the mid-90s I was offered a position at Borders College in Hawick. So I initially moved to a small village called Clovenfords, which is on the outskirts of Galashiels. And Clovenfords had a little country petrol station with a little country shop, and it had a pub attached to it. Anyway, I would often go up to the shop to buy provisions, milk, stuff like that. Anyway, the shop, which was tiny, was just before the area where you walked into the bar. And one night I went in, I don't know, to buy some milk, and I heard this big booming kind of theatrical voice. And this person seemed to be talking about, I remember hearing the words RADA and Johnny Hurt and Pat Stewart. And I put my head round to look into the bar, and he was this guy who I kind of recognised. And he was well tanked up. I mean, one thing I discovered about Gareth was that he liked his cider. He was well tanked up, but he was actually entertaining what I can only describe as a crowd of farm labourers with all these kind of stories about his acting career. Anyway, I took the opportunity to basically kind of go in, buy a drink, and just kind of sit down and listen. And anyway, as the farm labourers drifted off, it was just me and Gareth Thomas, who I had by that point clicked. That's the man. That's Blake himself. So something though said to me, don't talk about Blake 7, because I had read things that perhaps Gareth had left Blake 7 and was perhaps worried about being typecast and stuff. So anyway, I hung in there, and I was with Gareth in that bar till quite late, well beyond closing time. And I listened, we talked. He was very interested in what I was doing at the college, very interested in what I was doing as a filmmaker, and we talked. Still had not, at this point, talked about Blake 7. But in terms of the college, he said that he would be interested in coming in and talking about his career and doing some acting workshops. And because we then met up to talk about that, and then he did come down to the college to do some acting workshops. And then from that, he told me that he had a writing friend who was working on a hospital comedy, and would I like to become the kind of third co-writer. We then got involved in that, so quite a lot of meetings at his house. He had a beautiful house. I don't know how many of you know that area, but next to Clovenfords, there's another little hamlet called Peel. There's a lovely river. It might be the Tweed, I can't remember. So basically Gareth was living in a really beautiful house right on the river's edge. And it was in his kind of wood-lined kitchen over many coffees. I'm not a big cider drinker, but he certainly put some ciders back. It was in that kitchen, basically working on this film script, that then the conversation kind of turned to Blake 7. And for Blake 7 fans out there, I'd probably condense it by saying this. Gareth was delighted to get the lead in Blake 7. But as the show progressed and became more popular, his agent put the thought in his head that if you stay with this show too long, you're going to become typecast. And this thought kind of pervaded with Gareth, because Gareth was RADA trained, he'd done masses of theatre, he didn't want to be stuck as Blake. So he quit Blake 7. And fans of Blake 7 will know that Avon then became the predominant character, and I think the last two series, part of the mystery of the show was what's happened to Blake, and then Gareth came back for the final dramatic episode. But once he left, and once the show finished, and once his friend Patrick Stewart, who was also a Shakespearean actor, went to America and did Star Trek: The Next Generation, and Gareth was very aware of the opportunities that had come to Patrick Stewart through Star Trek, not just financially, but in terms of Patrick Stewart being able to choose and finance almost any theatre show or movie that he chose to do. Gareth often wondered if he'd stuck with Blake 7, whether or not he might have had that same opportunity. I think the answer to that is probably no, because I don't think the BBC was set up for really maximising the success of Blake 7 and actually doing lots of spin-offs and all the rest of it. I know that Paul Darrow, who played Avon, he attempted for many years to try and get a movie off the ground and get a TV show off the ground. But anyway, Gareth was stuck in that kind of situation of, was he right to quit Blake 7? And I think that kind of played on him a wee bit. I think he was also bemused, excited, but also slightly embarrassed by the fame that had come with Blake 7. He was probably sick of actually talking about it. So when I, as a fan, as a filmmaker, was able to ask him questions about Blake 7, I think he kind of felt that was kind of appropriate, because I wasn't kind of asking him as a fan, I was kind of asking him as a filmmaker. And anybody who's seen the Artemis films will probably straight away see a lot of influence of Blake 7 in some of those films that we made, particularly Terminal 7, which Richard directed. That's almost a kind of homage, I think, in an extent to Blake 7. And Richard, I think, on one occasion did actually meet Gareth. Richard had actually come down to visit me, and Gareth actually turned up in his car and rolled down the window, and we exchanged a few words. And then as Gareth drove off, I'm pretty sure Richard said, "Was that?" And I said, "Yup, that was Blake." So Yeah, so even at that time, Gareth told me this story whereby he was woken up in the middle of the night about 2 o'clock, and he went to his door, and I hasten to add he lived in the middle of nowhere. You know, it was a really remote part of the Scottish borders. Anyway, he opened his door, and what should be there but kind of 4, what he described as Japanese schoolgirls, and they had made the journey to Edinburgh. And this is kind of pre-internet, so I don't know how they found out where he lived. They'd then taken a taxi from Edinburgh to this tiny village, and they'd knocked on Gareth's door because they were massive Blake 7 fans. And to give Gareth his dues, and also to prove what a gentleman he was, he basically invited them in. He sat them round the table, made them cups of coffee and whatever. Toasted cheese was one of the things he used to do with his toaster. And he sat around until the early hours, and he answered all their questions. And they took lots of pictures, and off they went back to Edinburgh. And I think that one incident proves that you kind of become comfortable with being Blake, and was happy providing people showed respect to basically kind of talk about Blake and all the rest of it. But no, I found him a very engaging and talented guy. We once did poetry readings in the big church in Galashiels. And again, as somebody who's not theatrically trained, I actually thought it was, I suppose, quite an honour to be asked to actually do a public poetry reading next to a guy who was theatrically trained, especially with my kind of nasally kind of Lanarkshire accent. And we collaborated on a hospital drama, which I have to say, it turned out a wee bit like kind of Carry On Nurse, you know, but that's the kind of way the other 2 guys wanted to go. And we put it in for funding for something called Tartan Shorts, and I got a knockback. So it was no surprise to me that the learned people at Scottish Screen, Gareth Thomas, I don't really think kind of meant much to them. I kind of assumed that because Gareth was going to star in it and co-produce it, and he was the co-writer, that might have cut some, but it didn't. But then these are the same people who turned down Randall Wallace, who flew to Glasgow to try and get backing for Braveheart, and they told him it was a film nobody wanted to see. It was only because he met Mel Gibson at a party in Hollywood that the whole thing happened. So there's a few more kind of tales about Gareth Thomas. Gareth agreed to take a part in a film that I shot in the 90s. A film which sadly was never completed, but we still have footage from that film, and I think I'm going to do something with it at some point. I cut an Artemis documentary back in 2017 that took us up to Ghost Dancer in 93, but Artemis also had a history that went from basically 93 right up to 99. So within that second documentary, I think that's probably the time to kind of explore that particular movie.